Samuel chapter 22. First Samuel chapter 22. David is in exile now. That started at the end of chapter 20. Saul has him wandering around on the run. He's what we would call a fugitive. We saw last week where he came upon the priests in Nob. He was hungry. The priest there, Ahimelech, fed him. We read about the episode in Gath. We read about how he was there with the Philistines and had to pretend to be crazy, to be insane, to be mad, so that they would let him go. That they would not. They recognized him. They knew who he was. But when he feigned his insanity, the king didn't want anything to do with him. So David has escaped harm, and yet during this exile, much is still to befall him. We still have a few chapters to deal with David in exile. And it's important for us to read these. It's important for us to learn these. If we're not careful, we like, the Cliff Notes and the Wikipedia style of give me the highlights of somebody's life, right? Give me all the high points. And if we're not careful, we look at David as somebody who comes on the scene. He's a predecessor of Jesus Christ. He kills the giant. He wins some battles with the Philistines, and he becomes king of Israel. And you are cutting out a large chunk of David's life. You're cutting out a large portion of years from the time he kills Goliath until the time he becomes king. And those are not always filled with high points. They are filled with faith. They are filled with trust. And yet we learn in the Psalms that faith and that trust is mingled with the reality of situations that he's going through. Those Psalms are outpourings of his heart that are often spurred by situations that he's dealing with. We're going to see that again tonight. There's at least 3 different Psalms that are spurred by the events of chapter 22. Number 1, let's look at Adullam's cave. Adullam's cave. It says here in verse number 1, David therefore departed thence and escaped to the cave Adullam. David has been through a lot, right? He had a quick rise to fame, victories over the Philistines, a marriage to the king's daughter, repeated attempts on his life, an unusual farewell, and life now as a fugitive. And that has only been in the last short burst of time. But he temporarily, it seems like he's found a place. He's been on the run. He's been a fugitive. He's escaped harm from the land of the Philistines, from Gath. And he finds this place of refuge here, this cave called Adullam. Now this is here that he pens a couple of different psalms. I'm just going to read a couple of the superscriptions if you have a second to look at Psalm 142. Psalm 142. Psalm 142 in the superscription says, Maskil of David, a prayer when he was in the cave. And then in Psalm number 57, again here in Psalm number 57, a psalm of David when he fled from Saul in the cave. Now David had found refuge and he had found help in that cave, and the events show some of the prayers, some of the pleadings that he gives before the Lord. We won't take a lot of time to go through those psalms. I have a feeling we'll get there eventually, and Brother John will teach us through those things, and I'm sure he'll recall some of the events that spurred those things, so that we get the balance from both points of view, both from the historical event and from the psalm perspective. But he's found help. He's found at least a temporary place of refuge. He's cried to the Lord. He's called upon the Lord. That shows us his heart in this time. Now, if you keep reading in 1 Samuel 22, you actually find that it's here that David also finds some help in the form of company, in the form of folks starting to rally to him. Now, you get the picture thus far that if David's not alone, it's a really restricted and limited number of people that were with him when he left Jonathan. It says here in 1 Samuel 22, verse 1, "And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him." So we see a number here. His family hear about him, hear about what's going on. Word spreads that David has found a hiding place, that David is here in this cave. And when his family hears it, they come to him. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Of course, as his family, they want to come, they want to help, they want to comfort David. Of course, realistically, another reason is fear of Saul themselves, right? Saul is on a rampage. Saul is furious, and David's family knows that Bethlehem's not safe for them. Saul's going to be watching. Saul's going to be on the lookout. And so they find where David is, and a number of David's family come to him there in that cave. And then in verse 2 it says, "And everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented, gathered themselves unto him. And he became a captain over them, and there were with him about 400 men." We see also another number here, "gathered to him of the men of Israel." And every preacher would like to preach a whole sermon, right? Because this verse alliterates itself, right? Those that are in distress, those that are in debt, and those that are discontented. David finds help. David finds a rallying call in these that will enlist in his service. It speaks about those who are in distress, those that were also facing problems. Listen, it's tough right now in the nation of Israel, and men have had problems of their own. Many have had lives of difficulties, and they found someone that they felt they have that in common with in David. How many times do we see that, right? That there's a tendency or a propensity in us to join with those that are of like mind in some of the struggles and some of the difficulties. Man, I can relate to this guy. I'm going through that same kind of thing. I know what it's like to be outcast. I know what it's like to be, to feel like a fugitive. I know what it's like to feel on the run and hopeless and helpless. And that becomes a rallying call. It mentions those that are in debt. There were men in Israel that had fallen on hard times. Successes of the past are long gone, and men have indebted themselves in some form or another, and they feel oppressed by the creditors that were coming after them. And they felt that they had someone in David that they could go and that they could rally to. And then it speaks of those that were discontented. And that phrase discontented deals with a bitterness of soul. There were men that were unhappy. They were unhappy with the current state of things. They were discontent with the current leadership. You're going to see that a lot this year, right? We're in an election year. And there's going to be a lot of people that are going to vote for one side, and the reason they're going to vote for that side is because they're unhappy with the current side, right? There's just, sometimes in politics, you just got that pendulum effect, right? The lesser evil is the guy that we don't know anything about, right? But there's people that aren't happy with what's going on in Israel. And they rally to David. And they enlist in his service. The weary are coming to David. And people, you might look at this and say, well, what kind of help are these guys going to be? He's got all the people that are grumpy. He's got all the people that aren't happy. He's got all the people that are coming with nothing but troubles. Actually, if you read later in the scriptures, you're going to find that this is a great stock. And from this stock are a great number of men. In fact, if you compare a couple of verses from 2 Samuel and then go to 1 Chronicles, it appears that maybe 3 of the ones that they called David's mighty men come out of this ragtag group of individuals. And so this is exactly what David needed. You see a portion of people aligning themselves, common folks with common problems, and they rally to him. And David looks like he's finally starting to get some help. Number 2, let's talk about David's family. Now, I just mentioned to us in the first verse how some of his brother or his father's house came to him. We read now in verse number 3 that David went thence to Mizpah of Moab. And he said unto the king of Moab, Let my father and my mother, I pray thee, come forth and be with you till I know what God will do for me. David realizes, I got to find a safe place for mom and dad. Saul's on the warpath. Saul's in a fury. Saul's attacking with vengeance. And I got to find a safe place for my own parents. So he goes to Moab. He wanted to make sure that his parents could be protected should Saul strike against his family. His reasonings led him to take them to Moab, partially because it's assumed that maybe that was a spot that Saul would not suspect as much. Also, there is a family lineage there, right? Ruth was a Moabitess. Ruth was David's great-grandmother. We're not that far removed from that story, right? Ruth and her family were from Moab. There would have been, certainly a remembrance of that story, and maybe there's some kind of relation or some kind of, remembrance that could be worked in those details. But notice David, what he says there, let my father and my mother, I pray thee, come forth and be with you till I know what God will do for me. Those are interesting words, right? Till I know what God will do for me. Now, what does David know right now? Well, he's been anointed. He knows that he's been told by the prophet that he is going to be the king of Israel. And yet, from the looks of this verse and the situations that David has been surrounded by thus far, he might know that God's going to make him king one day, but it's clear right here in this moment, he doesn't have any clue how that's going to work. He doesn't have any clue how God's going to work that out. And there are times that are like that, right? That we have a faith in God, we have a trust in God, but if you've ever felt alone and not knowing, like, Lord, I just don't see or understand, I don't know what's next, you're in good company. That's exactly what David said. I need a safe place to hide my parents until I know what God's going to do. I don't know how God's going to work this out. I don't know what's coming next. So he does what he thinks he can do and finds a place to protect his family, but he's not sure. He's just not sure what's coming next. Now, I will read one verse in that psalm. In Psalm 142, in Psalm 142, remember the superscription there was that it was a prayer when he was in the cave. I want you to notice this prayer, these words that David said. Psalm 142, we'll key in on verse 3 when we get there, but just start there. I cried, verse 1, unto the Lord with my voice unto the Lord did I make my supplication. I poured out my complaint before him. I showed before him my trouble. We've been reading about that trouble that he's in. Verse 3, when my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then thou knewest my path. Now, he just told you in 1 Samuel that he doesn't know the path. I have to find somewhere to hide my folks till I find out what God's going to do. Now, this is exactly how life is sometimes. David, with all the faith and all the trust that he has within him, that he can muster, he believes, he knows that God knows his path. But he can also confess, I sure don't. I don't know what that path is. And yet, he can trust that God does know that path. So what is he going to do? He's going to do what he can in the here and now. He wants to protect his family. He wants to keep as many people safe as he can. He begins to work that until I can get some more answers, until I can get some more know-how on what to do or what God's going to do for me next. So it says there in verse number 4, 1 Samuel 22, verse 4, that he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the while that David was in the hold. So this fortified place that they had there, David left them there. Now verse number 5 says, and the prophet Gad said unto David, abide not in the hold, depart and get thee into the land of Judah. Then David departed and came into the forest of Hereth. Now, when the prophet comes to David, I think we can all understand what David did in an attempt to protect his family, right? He goes to Moab, takes his mom and dad to safety, provides a place for them in the stronghold that was there, the fortress, whatever's intended by that term hold. But then the prophet comes and tells him, look, you can't stay here. Now, David is certainly not going to gain any sympathy lurking around in a foreign land. That looks suspicious. That's not what God's intent and plan was for David, was to roam around in a foreign land all the time. Okay, you took your parents there, you took them to safety, but you can't stay here. He needed to get back to where his people were. Was it going to be dangerous? Yes, it was going to be dangerous. Yet we know later from this story, from the Psalms that he wrote, from how this plays out, that it's going to be the trial of his faith and his courage that prepares David for when it's his time in the kingdom. Okay, so notice the balance there. David did what he thought that he needed to do, and then the prophet comes and says, okay, but you can't stay here. You have to go back to Judah. You have to go back to your people. This isn't going to be, it was not God's plan for David to go hide out in a foreign land just until, Saul dies, and then he'll just come back, like a triumphant hero. That was not God's purpose. David doesn't know what God's going to do, but the prophet tells him, this ain't it. Staying in Moab's not it. So you got to go back home. Number 3, let's talk about Saul's fury. Saul's fury. The rest of this chapter deals with the outcome of what we talked about last week. Now, what did we talk about last week? David went on the run. David was hungry. He came to Nob, where the priests were. And he wasn't entirely honest with them, was he, about what had happened? He told them that he was on an errand from Saul. He was on an errand from the king. He was about the king's business. And you and I know that that's not true. David did that and said those things to protect himself and to protect any that would have been with him. Now, let's look at our story tonight here, verse number 6. It says, when Saul heard that David was discovered, and the men that were with him, now Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having his spear in his hand. That means he was ready for war. And all his servants were standing about him. Then Saul said to his servants that stood about him, hear now, ye Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? Well, what's David going to do for you, you Benjamites? Now, what was Saul? Saul was a Benjamite. He's basically accusing his own family, right? He surrounded himself with servants of his own tribe. You think David would do that for you? What has David promised you? Did David promise you something that you'd turn against a king from your own tribe? Or will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? What does verse 8 say? That all of you have conspired against me? And there is none that showeth me that my son hath made a league with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you that is sorry for me, or showeth unto me that my son hath stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait, as it is this day. Saul accuses all of his servants of conspiring against. Now this is how much Saul has lost it now. Everybody's against him. And he stands there under a tree with his spear in his hand, and as he's looking off in the distance, he just starts to question everybody. How come nobody told me? Y'all knew. Did David put you up to this? Did David make you some kind of a promise? Why is it that nobody told me that my own son had conspired against me? How come is it that nobody told me that my son had made an alliance and was friendly with David? How come? Why did nobody tell me? And Saul basically accuses all of his servants of being deceptive, of being misleading, of being treasonous against him, and none of you are sorry for me. I feel like I've been stabbed in the back and none of you care. This is like a really pathetic pity party, and Saul is just, He's gone crazy. Now, none of it's true anyway. Jonathan did not turn against his father. Jonathan talked to his father. Jonathan dealt with his father in saying, Dad, what did he do? The league or the agreement and covenant that Jonathan made with David was to Jonathan's own hurt, not Saul's. Obviously, Jonathan, recognizing that David would be the next king, that God had anointed David, that David was next to the throne, any league or covenant that Jonathan made with David was probably to his own personal hurt. That really suppresses his own personal ambitions. But he didn't do anything against his father. He never helped David lead a revolt against Saul or against the house of Saul. He didn't do any of those things. This is a lie. It's not true. Now, Saul feels slighted. Saul feels like everyone has turned against him, including his son. But that's just kind of how people are when they feel that they've been slighted. Verse number 9. Then answered Doeg the Edomite. That name sounds familiar, doesn't it? You know why it sounds familiar? Because he was in the last chapter. Do you remember when David was hungry and he found the priest at Nob and he asked for that bread? The Bible told us in chapter 21 that there just so happened to be a man detained at the house of the Lord. And his name was Doeg the Edomite, and he was a captain of Saul's. Doeg saw all that happened in that last chapter. And it tells us here in verse number 9, Then answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him. He gave him victuals, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Doeg enters the scene, and all the things that he saw last week when we talked about that chapter, he starts spilling his guts. He's happy to divert Saul's fury. Saul's mad at everybody. He's going to accuse everybody of treachery and treason. And Doeg's like, wait a minute now. No, I know where David's at. I don't know where David's at, but I know who's helped him. I know that it wasn't too long ago, David was down at Nob, and he was with Ahimelech the high priest, or the priest there, and he says that he inquired of the Lord for him. And he's supplying him. You know, that priest is supplying David with food and weapons. And he inquired of the Lord for him. Now, what Doeg does in saying that, he makes it look like Ahimelech is active in this conspiracy. Now, remember, last week, Ahimelech didn't know anything that was going on. In fact, when David showed up by himself, the Bible said that Ahimelech was afraid. Why are you here alone? What in the world's going on? This is the king's son-in-law. This is one of his servants. He should have an entourage. Ahimelech didn't have any clue what was going on. And honestly, David lied to him. David did not tell him the truth. David said, I'm on an errand from the king and I'm desperate and we're hungry. Ahimelech doesn't know any of the stuff that's been going on. But Doeg makes it sound like he's part of a conspiracy. So in verse number 11, it says, Then the king sent to call Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests that were in Nob, and they all came of them to the king. And Saul said, Hear now, thou son of Ahitub. And he answered, Here I am, my lord. And Saul said unto him, Why have ye conspired against me, thou and the son of Jesse, in that thou hast given him bread and a sword, and hast inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait as it is this day? Saul has Ahimelech and all his family and all those priests come and stand before him. And what's going on, guys? I hear that you all have conspired against me, and you all are helping the son of Jesse in his rebellion against me. You're supplying him. You're inquiring of the Lord for him. Well, look at verse 14. Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, you can tell by his answer, he has no clue, right? Verse 14, who is so faithful among all thy servants as David? What are you talking about, conspiracy? David's one of your most loyal servants. Ahimelech is just totally oblivious to what's going on. He has no clue. And now he stands before the king of Israel and he's being, called a traitor. He's being conjured up in some kind of conspiracy. And what in the world are you talking about? I thought David was your loyal servant. I thought you and David were on the same page. He calls him in verse 14 the king's son-in-law. He goeth at thy bidding and is honorable in thine house. The last time I saw David, he was on an errand from you. So he thinks, right? So verse 15, did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Be it far from me. Let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to all the house of my father, for thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. I don't have any clue what you're talking about. As far as I'm concerned, David has always been a faithful and loyal servant to your son-in-law. He runs errands for you. I wasn't inquiring of God for him. He doesn't, you can't deny that he gave him bread, but it wasn't at all to Ahimelech an attempt to subvert the king. It wasn't at all in an attempt to be treacherous or to be treasonous against the king. Don't impute this unto us. No, we aren't against you. We didn't conspire against you. Not a bit. And so in verse number 16, the king said, thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and all thy father's house. Saul wants the priests dead because he thinks they conspired against him. Now I want you to know how insane that sounds, that he doesn't just want David dead, and he's not just going to put a hit out on David's family. He wants anybody that he thinks has had anything to do with David. And it doesn't matter if they are the priests in Israel. He feels that he has been conspired against and he wants them all dead. Look at verse 17. It says that the king said to the footmen that stood about him, turn, slay the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not show it to me. But the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priests of the Lord. Even the words coming out of Saul's mouth, people were like, this is crazy. This is nuts. This is insane. You want to kill all the priests? Yep. They knew, and they didn't know. They had no clue that this was going on in David's house, in Saul's house. They had no idea. But Saul wants him dead, and everybody's afraid. Like, nobody wants to do anything. Like, I want to obey the king, but like, you're telling us to kill priests. That doesn't make any sense. And so in verse number 18, the king said to Doeg, and he's not an Israelite, is he? We're not sure that he's an Israelite. Edom, he says there, turn thou and fall upon the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned, and he fell upon the priests and slew on that day fourscore and 5 persons that did wear a linen ephod. And then he went third world dictator style, and he put out a hit on anybody that had anything to do with the priests and the conspirators. Look at verse 19. And Nob, the city of the priests, smote he with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and sucklings, and oxen and asses and sheep, with the edge of the sword. Doeg was only too happy to fulfill the king's order and get back in the king's good graces, right? Doeg and all the servants of Saul have just been accused of conspiracy themselves. And now, nope, we'll pin this conspiracy on somebody. I saw David down there with those priests in Nob. And then when nobody would kill the priests like Saul had requested or ordered to be done, Doeg says, I'll do it. And he kills the priests. And he goes to Nob and he kills basically everybody in that town. Now, Saul has come unhinged. You remember back in chapter 15, Saul wouldn't even kill all of God's enemies. Remember the people that he spared? Remember how he spared King Agag? But he won't spare when he feels slighted. And he has the priests killed. And this is a cruel wrath here in these verses. 85 priests, and then the rest of their families in that city, in that town. Now, one person is able to escape. It says in verse 21, and Abiathar showed David that Saul had slain the Lord's priests. And David said unto Abiathar, I knew it that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. Now this is a heart of grief that is now filled totally with guilt. When Abiathar tells David what happened, David looks at him and says, it's my fault. I knew when Doeg was there, that's one of Saul's, he's going to say something. I knew that day he was going to tell him, this is all my fault. That's what it says there in verse 22. When it says, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house, you are to understand that is David saying, this is my fault. This is all my fault. David realized that he had put Ahimelech in a vulnerable position. He lied to him. And that left Ahimelech vulnerable because Ahimelech, out of a clean and clear conscience, helped David. And there was no thought of conspiracy against Saul. There was no thought of treachery. There was no thought in his mind that there's any kind of beef or any kind of issue between David and Saul at all. And he did what he could to help someone that came to him hungry and desperate. And David realizes this is my fault. This is my fault. And listen, there would be at this point no way for you to tell David, oh no, David, it's not your fault. He feels incredibly and deeply guilty for this. I set him up. I lied to him. I put him in a vulnerable position. And I saw that Doeg was there, and I knew he can't keep his mouth shut, and he was going to say so. I knew this was going to happen, and it's all my fault. Now, these times prompted David to write the 52nd Psalm. Now, if you'll turn there really quick. Psalm number 52. Psalm 52, to the chief musician, Maskil, a psalm of David, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and said unto him, David is come to the house of Ahimelech. So Psalm 52 is written under the context of what we've just talked about. David knows it's kind of my fault. I put him in a vulnerable spot. And that does not alleviate Doeg of his responsibility in this. And in Psalm 52, there is a very blunt, there's just some very blunt words here about Doeg. Now notice here in verse 1, why boasteth thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? Now, again, there's sometimes you read the Psalms and you can interpret these in a generic sense. David does have somebody pretty specifically in mind with this one. The goodness of God endureth continually. Thy tongue deviseth mischiefs like a sharp razor, working deceitfully. Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than to speak righteousness. Thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue. God shall likewise destroy thee forever. He shall take thee away and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place and root thee out of the land of the living. And David can only take solace and confidence in the fact that God is going to take care of Doeg, that God will return to him upon his own head for the things which he has just done. That's weird, right? How at one time, and that's just kind of the way that things work, and that's how things work out. Who would you say is responsible for the events of chapter 22? Who is responsible for all of those priests being killed? David feels like he's responsible. He feels like it's his fault all of these things happened. Is he right? Kinda. But it's also Doeg's fault, isn't it? Doeg's the one that did the dirty work. Doeg is the one that actually killed those priests and all those people of Nob. He's responsible. Saul's responsible. Saul ordered the hit. Saul ordered it to be done. In a weird, not to get too far sidetracked, you'll read some different scriptures, you'll read some commentaries, and this stuff was prophesied. You remember when Eli was told, all your descendants, the day is coming when you won't have anybody left to sit as priest in Israel. And you won't have anyone left in your house to see old age. And now all the prophecy that was given back to Eli, all those chapters ago, is starting to come through. How do you reconcile all of these? Well, God is working a purpose in Israel. He is working a purpose that will bring about the downfall of Saul, the elevation of David, the outworkings of the judgment that he had already pronounced in a previous generation upon Eli. Now listen, that's kind of how this world works. Everyone feels kind of isolated in their own little pockets, and they don't always see the big picture, that there is a purpose that is being worked all the time overall, that God is in control of, that God is the mastermind of. And while David feels incredibly guilty, he also feels a great retribution that needs to fall on those that perpetrated this. David feels, in one sense, he can cry that I caused this. And yet he knows, and he can say, God, you need to do something with Doeg, the man that caused this, the man that did this. Listen, this chapter is another one. With David in exile, you see this wide range of emotions, right? There's this loneliness as he goes, as he finally gets out of Gath, as he gets away from the Philistines and he escapes and he comes to this cave. And then maybe there's a little energy that gets, as people kind of start to rally to him. He's got some that are committed to his cause, and he's got a number that want to gather to him. He realizes, though, that his parents are unsafe, and then worry starts to set in. So he takes them somewhere and wants to make sure that they're safe. And he comes back to Judah, and he has to deal with the after effects of what he feels that he caused in the previous chapter. And so again, when we talked about it last week, we'll say the same thing again. When you read these, you read in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, you read the stories, you read the historical events, just in a historical matter of fact. This is what happened, this is what happened, this is what happened. But then you get to see, as Brother John takes us through the Psalms, the heart, the emotion, right? These are real, when things happen to you, it makes you feel certain ways. And all the emotion that gets bottled up, the Psalms are an outpouring of that as he cries to the Lord. And you can tell that there's worry, there's fear at times. Here in this chat, he feels guilty. There's anger about what Doeg has done. All of this wide range of emotion. So it's important, again, keep that in mind and balance those. Read those Psalms with the historical events so that you get to see the facts, and then you get to see what that is doing to David inside. You get to see his mind and his heart as he goes through all of those things. Last verse here, verse number 23, abide thou with me. He tells the one that escaped, Abiathar, the last one here, abide thou with me, fear not. For he that seeketh my life seeketh thy life. But with me thou shalt be in safeguard. Sometimes the only thing that you can rally around is what you've got in common, right? And David's like, well, he's after both of us now. But you'll be safe with me. And we're going to be able to see in the next couple chapters, David's still wandering, right? He's still a fugitive. He's still in exile. And he's on this roller coaster of there are great highs and there are great lows. There are worries, there are fears, there are exciting things, there's victories, there's joys, there's all of those. You get the wide range of emotion and perspective in the life of David as he runs as a fugitive from Saul. But chapter 22, if it doesn't do anything else, it does a couple of those things. It shows us that wide range of emotion that David goes through, the horrible guilt that he feels for causing this. But it's also got us one step closer to Saul's down. Saul has completely become unhinged. It was one thing when it was just David that he felt was against him. And then he felt that it was his son that was against him. And now everybody's conspiring against him. And he'll go so far as to order the priests of the Lord. Saul is starting to make commands now where people are looking at him and recognizing, I think Saul's going too far. Saul has become just completely unglued here. As the Spirit has departed from him, and it becomes clear that he no longer has that equipping of the Lord to lead Israel, he has absolutely become insane himself for real. To order the things that he's ordering, to just assume that everybody's out to get him, just assume everybody's in a conspiracy against him. He will stop at nothing to get David. And he wants David gone, and anybody that has anything to do with David. David's family's not safe. The priests, obviously here tonight, aren't safe. But Saul is on a fast spiral downwards. All right? All right, let's have a word of prayer. We'll be dismissed. Appreciate your attention tonight. Take a look at those Psalms, though, if you would sometime. Again, Psalm number 52, Psalm 142, Psalm 57, all three of those surrounding the events of tonight. I think you'll enjoy those. Father, we're thankful